Before Dirk Blocker ever spoke a single line on screen, the world already knew his last name. Born in 1957, Dirk was the son of Dan Blocker, the larger-than-life actor best known as Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, one of the most popular TV shows in American history. For millions of fans, Dan was a lovable gentle giant who brought warmth and humor to their living rooms each week. But to Dirk, he was simply Dad. Growing up in Los Angeles, Dirk's earliest memories weren't playgrounds or cartoons. They were dusty film sets, camera crews, and cowboy boots. The Bonanza set was practically an extension of his childhood home. While most kids were playing with plastic pistols, Dirk was watching real westerns come to life just a few feet away. He saw his father go from kind-hearted parent to powerful character with a wardrobe change and a cue from a director. For a child, that transformation was nothing short of magical. But fame has a way of warping reality, especially for children. Dirk quickly realized that his life was different. His father couldn't walk down the street without someone recognizing him. People stared at Dirk, too, not because they knew who he was, but because of who his dad was. From school teachers to strangers at the grocery store, everyone had something to say about Hoss. And while there was a sense of pride in that, it also planted a seed of quiet pressure. How do you become your own person when the world already has a version of you in their mind? At home, Dan did everything he could to keep his children grounded. He made sure Dirk and his siblings understood that kindness mattered more than applause. Dan was a father who cooked dinner, helped with homework, and made corny jokes at the dinner table. Fame wasn't a badge he wore home. In fact, Dan often went out his way to keep his family shielded from Hollywood's chaos. He believed in discipline, respect, and treating people decently, no matter how many people were watching. Still, there was no escaping the fact that Dirk was growing up in a world few could relate to. Other kids bragged about baseball games or camping trips. Dirk could casually mention that he'd watched an episode of Bonanza being filmed from behind the camera. It was exciting, but also isolating. He belonged to a family the world adored. Yet he sometimes felt invisible behind the towering presence of his dad. This early exposure to the entertainment industry lit a quiet fire in Dirk. He loved storytelling and admired the way his father could captivate an audience with sincerity and heart. But deep down, he also wondered if he'd ever be seen for who he was. Not just as Dan Blocker's boy, but as someone who had something to offer on his own terms. And that question would follow him for years. To the world, Dan Blocker was a towering cowboy with a warm heart. The kind of character who could toss a villain across a saloon and then apologize for it. But behind the scenes, away from the Western sets and autograph signings, Dan was something far more powerful. A deeply grounded man who never let fame define his values. And to Dirk Blocker, he was the definition of strength paired with softness, a true gentle giant. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches and weighing over 300 pounds, Dan could have easily leaned into intimidation, but that was never his style. Colleagues described him as gentle, thoughtful, and fiercely loyal. He had a booming laugh and a kind word for everyone on set, whether they were studio executives or stagehands. That humility wasn't an act, it was who he was, and it shaped how he parented. Dan made a clear distinction between who he was on screen and who he was at home. He never brought Hoss through the front door. At home, Dan wasn't the star of the show. He was just Dad, the guy who loved grilling in the backyard, helping with school projects, and reading to his kids at night. Despite his grueling filming schedule on Bonanza, Dan always made time for family dinners and weekend getaways. Fame didn't give him a pass on fatherhood. In fact, it made him even more determined to be present. He understood how show business could chew people up, and he didn't want that for his children. Dirk remembers his father not just for the roles he played, but for the values he lived. Respect, honesty, and humility weren't lessons. They were daily examples. Dan didn't lecture about decency. He modeled it, whether it was how he spoke to fans or how he treated waitstaff at restaurants. He showed Dirk what it meant to be a man of character. These lessons would stick with Dirk far more than any advice about acting or the industry. What made Dan even more remarkable was how little he cared about his celebrity status. While others sought the spotlight, he often retreated from it. He didn't chase magazine covers or fame for its own sake. Instead, He took his family to live in Switzerland for a time, prioritizing his kids' education and giving them a broader worldview. He wanted them to understand that life was bigger than television and that their self-worth shouldn't come from public applause. In many ways, Dan was a quiet rebel in an industry full of ego. He built his career with integrity and raised his children with the same mindset. For Dirk, that left a legacy not of pressure, but of purpose. It wasn't about living up to a legend. It was about living with intention, compassion, and humility. And while Dan's life was tragically cut short, the way he lived never left his son. Dirk didn't just inherit his father's name. He inherited the quiet strength that came with it. Dirk Blocker was just 14 years old when everything he knew about safety, family, and stability collapsed in an instant. On May 13, 1972, Dan Blocker, the larger-than-life man who filled every room with warmth, died suddenly during what was expected to be a routine gallbladder surgery. The complications that followed left the Blocker family in shock, and the entertainment world mourning the loss of one of its most beloved stars. But for Dirk, it was something far deeper than public grief. It was the moment his world fractured. There was no warning. One day, Dan was cracking jokes at the dinner table, and the next, he was gone. Dirk didn't have time to prepare, process, or understand. At 14, most kids worry about homework and weekend plans, not burying their fathers. The emotional impact was something Dirk would carry quietly for decades. Because when you lose a parent at that age, especially one as present and loving as Dan, it changes the trajectory of your life forever. The house, once full of laughter, fell silent. The man who had always been the anchor was suddenly just a memory. Photographs, old episodes of Bonanza, and the echo of his voice in home movies. Dirk's mother, Dolphia, had to keep the family strong, but nothing could soften the blow. Fame didn't shield them from grief. If anything, it made it harder. They didn't just lose a dad, they lost him in front of the entire world. To the outside world, it was a tragedy. Newspapers covered Dan's death with headlines and tributes. Fans wrote letters. The cast of Bonanza mourned like family. But for Dirk, it was far more private. The loss of his role model, his protector, and the only man whose footsteps he truly wanted to follow. And in the years that followed, Dirk would wrestle with that absence in ways most people never saw. The pressure only grew. As Dirk began exploring acting, people constantly reminded him of his father. Casting agents, fans, even co-stars. Everyone had a story about Dan. They meant well, but for Dirk, it was a double-edged sword. How do you find your voice when everyone's still listening for your dads? Dan Blocker's death didn't just leave a gap in Bonanza. It left a massive hole in a young boy's heart, one that would take years to navigate. And though Dirk rarely spoke publicly about the pain, it shaped every decision he made after that. It made him cautious, thoughtful, and, above all, determined not to live in the shadow of a man everyone else already thought they knew. But grief has a strange way of forging strength. And in the quiet aftermath, Dirk began to look not just at who his father had been, but who he himself was meant to become. After Dan Blocker's sudden passing, Dirk was left with more than just grief. He was left with a name that carried weight, expectations, and an impossible legacy. Wherever he went, people smiled at him as if they already knew him. "You must be Haas's boy," they'd say, often with a warmth that was genuine, but never entirely separate from who his father had been. For a teenager trying to discover his own identity, that constant comparison wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Dirk knew early on that he wanted to act. The bug had bitten him during childhood, watching his father command a set with kindness and quiet power. But as he began auditioning, he realized something brutal. The industry didn't see him. They saw a carbon copy of Dan. Casting directors expected the same charm, the same size, even the same voice. It wasn't what can Dirk do. It was, can Dirk be like Dan? At first, he tried to play along. He leaned into familiar roles, military men, working-class guys, anything close to Haas. But it never felt right. It didn't feel like his path. The truth was, Dirk wasn't his father, and he didn't want to be. Dan was calm and commanding, but Dirk was quieter, more introspective. He didn't have the same physical presence, and he didn't want to chase fame the way others did. What he wanted was respect for his craft, his choices, and most of all, his differences. But carving your own identity in Hollywood, especially with a name like Blocker, isn't easy. The industry can be brutal with comparisons. And for every small victory, Dirk faced a dozen subtle reminders that he was still in his father's shadow. There were moments of doubt, nights where he wondered if he'd ever get out from under the Son of Haas label. And for a long time, he avoided talking about Dan publicly. Not because he wasn't proud, but because he didn't want that pride to drown out his own voice. Away from the cameras, Dirk focused on becoming his own man. He studied acting seriously, took risks in theater, and even walked away from roles that felt too much like echoes of his father's. Each step, each decision, was a small rebellion against the box the world tried to put him in. And over time, that quiet resistance began to work. Still, the pressure never fully disappeared. Even decades later, fans would bring up Dan first whenever they met Dirk. They meant no harm. It was a testament to how beloved his father was. But reminded Dirk of how long a shadow fame can cast. The irony? While he spent years trying not to be Haas's kid, it was the values Dan taught him, humility, patience, and perseverance, that helped him find his way. Dirk didn't want to escape his father's legacy. He just wanted to earn his own. It took Dirk Blocker years to step out from under the weight of his last name, but when he finally started landing roles, they weren't handed to him. He had to fight for everyone. The world had known him as Haas's kid, but Dirk was determined to be more than just someone's son. He wanted to be recognized for his own work, his own craft, and his own story. And the battle to get there wasn't glamorous. It was slow, grueling, and at times invisible. Dirk's early career was a series of steady, if not flashy, steps. He started appearing in TV shows during the 1970s, including roles in series like Little House on the Prairie and Baa Black Sheep. His first recurring role. That part was important not because it made him a star overnight, but because it proved something to him. He could hold his own in front of the camera without his father's shadow looming over performance. He was finally starting to earn his stripes, and not just because of his last name, but the road was anything but easy. Hollywood doesn't have much patience for slow-burn careers, and Dirk was never the loudest actor in the room. He didn't chase controversy, and he wasn't interested in tabloid fame. That meant fewer headlines, but also fewer shortcuts. He became known as a dependable character actor, the kind of performer directors loved because he showed up, did the work, and let the story speak for itself. Over the years, Dirk built a quiet but impressive resume. He played everything from detectives to doctors to quirky background characters. But there was always a humility in his approach, a sense that he wasn't trying to dominate the screen, but contribute to something bigger. That mindset, ironically, mirrored his father's approach to Bonanza. The difference was Dirk had to work twice as hard to prove he wasn't just riding on legacy. Then, in 2013, something unexpected happened. Dirk landed the role of Detective Michael Hitchcock on the hit comedy series Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It wasn't a lead role, but it quickly became one of the most memorable. Hitchcock, paired with his partner Scully, was ridiculous, lazy, and oddly lovable. Fans instantly connected with the character, and for the first time in decades, people were talking about Dirk Blocker not as Dan's son, but as the guy from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It was a long overdue recognition, and it hit differently. Dirk wasn't trying to become famous anymore. He just wanted to do good work. But the show's success proved that persistence, patience, and talent could outlast even the longest shadow. And it gave Dirk something more valuable than awards or headlines. It gave him ownership of his story. He didn't get there through scandal, spectacle, or shortcuts. He got there by showing up again and again until people finally saw him for who he was. Dirk Blocker never chased fame the way some actors do. He didn't crave the spotlight or headline roles. He didn't stir up controversy or build a social media empire. And yet, in his own steady way, he carved out a legacy that now stands on its own, built not on noise, but on consistency, integrity, and a quiet resilience that has lasted for decades. What's striking about Dirk's journey is how much it mirrors his father's, even though he spent so long trying to differentiate himself. Like Dan, Dirk earned a reputation in Hollywood for being reliable, kind, and deeply professional. Directors praised his work ethic. Co-stars often describe him as generous and easy to work with, never arrogant, never difficult. In an industry driven by egos and image, that kind of grounded presence is rare. Still, the emotional weight of Dan's legacy never truly disappeared. For years, fans of Bonanza would approach Dirk and recount how much Haas meant to them. They'd tell stories about watching the show with their families, or how Dan Blocker had reminded them of their own fathers. Some even got emotional, tears forming as they expressed their gratitude. At first, those encounters stirred up complex feelings for Dirk, but over time, he began to see them differently. Dan's legacy wasn't a shadow, it was a gift. The love that fans had for his father wasn't something Dirk needed to outrun. It was something he could embrace, without losing himself in the process. And as he grew older, he became more open about the ways his dad shaped him, not just as an actor, but as a man. In interviews, Dirk eventually began sharing more candid reflections about Dan. He talked about the pain of losing him young, the strength of his mother in holding the family together, and the way his father's lessons continued to echo through his life. Those insights surprised some fans. They had expected another actor interview. What they got was something far deeper, an honest, emotional account of what it means to live in the wake of someone so loved and still try to become your own person. And through it all, Dirk never used his father's name to shortcut his path. He took the long way, the hard way, earning every role, every compliment, and every moment of respect. That quiet perseverance became his calling card. Today, Dirk Blocker's legacy is twofold. He's known for his own career, his unforgettable role on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, his body of TV and film work, and his understated charm. But he's also the living bridge to a different era of Hollywood, one shaped by actors like his father, who believed that kindness, professionalism, and humility mattered more than fame. Dirk never tried to be loud. He didn't need to be. Sometimes, the most powerful legacies are the ones spoken softly, but remembered forever. For most of his life, Dirk Blocker stayed quiet about the loss of his father. Not because he didn't care, but because it was just too personal. And the spotlight that followed Dan's death never felt like the right place to unpack something so raw. Fans and journalists wanted to polish sound bites, but grief isn't something that fits neatly into an interview. So, for decades, Dirk let the silence do the talking. But something changed as the years passed, particularly after Brooklyn Nine-Nine gave him a new platform and a renewed connection with a younger audience. Suddenly, Dirk wasn't just Dan Blocker's son. He was a fan favorite in his own right. And with that shift came something unexpected. The freedom to speak more openly, not only about his own career, but about the deep, lasting impact his father had on his life. In rare interviews and moments on social media, Dirk began pulling back the curtain. He talked about how Dan's passing left a permanent imprint on his teenage mind, how grief never really disappears, and how trying to live up to someone's legacy can both guide and haunt a person. But what struck fans the most wasn't just what Dirk said, it was how he said it. There was no bitterness, no dramatics, just a quiet vulnerability that felt more authentic than anything you'd expect from a seasoned Hollywood actor. He wasn't trying to score points or write a tell-all. He was just sharing, and that honesty resonated, especially with those who had also lost loved ones and felt the weight of expectations in their own lives. Dirk opened up about how hard it was to step on a set and hear his father's name mentioned. Even years later, how the comparisons, while flattering, sometimes felt like invisible chains. And how, in spite of everything, he still considered himself lucky to have had a father like Dan, even if only for 14 years. He also began honoring Dan more publicly, sharing photos, stories, and little-known details about the man behind Haas. Not the actor, but the dad, the man who coached his kids in sports, played guitar around the house, and made them feel safe every single day. In doing so, Dirk helped fans see something deeper than a TV legend. He reminded them that behind every icon is a human being, and behind that, a family still feeling their absence. The openness wasn't a rebrand. It wasn't a media strategy. It was healing, not just for Dirk, but for fans who had mourned Dan for decades without knowing what had become the family he left behind. And as Dirk spoke, something remarkable happened. The world finally started listening. not to Haas's son, but to a man who had spent years in silence and had finally found the strength to share the truth. After decades of quiet resilience, Dirk Blocker's story is finally coming full circle. At 67, he's no longer just the son of Dan Blocker, the towering, kind-hearted Haas from Bonanza. He's a respected actor in his own right, a man who has endured loss, fought for his identity, and now chooses to honor his father's legacy on his own terms. Dirk's recent openness has stunned fans who never expected to hear such candid reflections from someone so private. It's a reminder that behind every famous name lies a complex human story, filled with struggles, hopes, and hard-earned wisdom. Dirk isn't interested in riding waves of nostalgia or capitalizing on his father's fame. Instead, he's focused on keeping the spirit of Dan Blocker alive in a way that feels real and respectful. For Dirk, that means embracing the lessons Dan taught him long ago: humility, kindness, and perseverance. It means living a life that's true to himself, while carrying forward the values his father held dear. It's a legacy not built on fame, but on character, and that legacy resonates far beyond Hollywood. In interviews and public appearances, Dirk often emphasizes how much his father's example shaped who he became, not just as an actor, but as a man. And it's clear that this legacy isn't a burden, but a source of strength. After all, it takes courage to live in the shadow of a legend and still find your own light. Dirk's journey also challenges how we think about celebrity families. Too often, children of famous people are boxed into expectations or dismissed as just riding coattails. Dirk's life is proof that with patience, hard work, and a clear sense of self, it's possible to forge your own path, even when your father's name echoes everywhere you go. His story isn't just about Hollywood or fame. It's about resilience in the face of loss, the search for identity, and the power of owning your truth. And that's a message anyone can relate to, no matter who their parents were or what shadows they walk beneath. As Dirk Blocker opens up more than ever before, fans are stunned, not just by the revelations, but by the quiet dignity he brings to the conversation. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the loudest, but the ones told with honesty and heart. At 67, Dirk Blocker isn't just Dan Blocker's son anymore. He's a man who has lived, lost, and learned. And now, finally, he's ready to share his story with the world. Thanks for watching and sticking with us through Dirk Blocker's incredible journey. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay curious.